Thank you so much for joining AI Dallas today for this special event discussing the potential for parking reform in the city of Dallas. As many of you know, the city has been reviewing potential amendments to this code to reduce or remove parking minimums from zoning requirements under Chapter 51 and 51A. This conversation has come a long way since it was kicked off formally almost a year ago. And it's a conversation that's happening simultaneously across the nation. In fact, I was having a similar conversation in our sister city in Fort Worth this morning. And we hope to learn a lot from our peer cities and from research that's both practical and inspirational. We're honored today to have the best of the best speaking together on a panel on this timely topic. I'll introduce our distinguished panel shortly after some initial remarks from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Shoup. We'll have a panel discussion with local experts. And as always, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A or the chat feature, and we'll draw from those questions towards the end of our program. First, I will introduce Dr. Shoup. So Dr. Shoup is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA. His research has focused on parking, transportation, public finance, and land economics. Dr. Shoup's work has caused many to call him the godfather of parking reform. In his seminal 2005 book, The High Cost of Free Parking, Shoup provided 3 central recommendations that cities should take, which include to charge fair market prices for on-street parking, number 2, to spend the revenue to benefit the metered areas, and 3, remove off-street parking requirements. In his 2018 edited book, Parking and the City, Shoup and 45 other academics and practicing planners examined the results where cities have adopted these policies. Shoup is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and honorary professor at the Beijing Transportation Research Center. He has received the American Planning Association's National Excellence Award for a Planning Pioneer and the American Collegiate School of Planning Distinguished Educators Award. Let's welcome Dr. Shoup.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I already feel like an honorary Texan. My father was born in Dallas in 1901, and my brother went to the University of Texas in the 1950s. But I understand that Texas has changed a lot since then. But let's go back to around 1900 and think of how we chose the path that we're on. Well, suppose around 1900, which is the dawn of the automobile age, Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller had asked city planners how to increase the demand for cars and gasoline. And consider 3 options to recommend to the Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller. First, divide the city into separate zones, housing here, jobs there, and shopping someplace else. And so to create travel between the zones. And then second, limit density to spread everything apart and further increase travel. And then third, require ample off-street parking everywhere to spread everything even farther apart and make the cars the easiest and the cheapest way to travel. Well, unfortunately, American cities have unwisely adopted these 3 car-friendly policies: separated land uses, low density, and ample free parking create drivable cities, but prevent walkable neighborhoods. And although city planners didn't intend to enrich the automobile and oil industries, they've shaped our cities to suit our cars. Now, I think that minimum parking requirements in zoning ordinance are particularly ill-advised, even if you have the other 2 components of zoning, because minimum parking requirements directly subsidize cars. We drive from one place to do one thing and then drive to another place to do another thing, and finally drive a long way back home, parking free almost everywhere. Off-street parking requirements are a fertility drug for cars. Well, no one wants to pay for parking, including me, but many people seem to think that parking is like sex. If you have to pay for it, it's just not right. In one Seinfeld episode, George Costanza explained why he never paid for parking. He said, paying for parking is like going to a prostitute. Why should I pay when, if I apply myself, maybe I can get it for free? Well, we're all trying to get it for free. There's nothing really wrong with that. But that's because usually some free curb parking is available. Well, everybody says that Texans are in love with their cars, but I believe it was an arranged marriage, with city planners acting as both matchmakers and members of the wedding party. Unfortunately, there was no prenuptial agreement to deal with problems that might arise, such as traffic congestion and air pollution and high cost of housing and global warming. Now I think it's time for city planners to act like divorce lawyers, to arrange a new relationship with cars, a friendly divorce. Well, the love affair with cars worked well for the oil and automobile industries. And so far as I know, neither of them ever advocated minimum parking requirements. Their customers are the ones who demand all the new freeways and ample free parking. And cities planners respond to what voters want. But it's a great deal for the automobile and oil industries if their customers are demanding lots of wider roads and plenty of free parking. Well, nobody likes to pay for parking, but that doesn't mean we should make free parking a central feature of city planning by imposing minimum parking requirements on all buildings. Well, I think this is a good time for you to look at minimum parking requirements reform in Dallas. Until recently, curb parking has been a neglected link between transportation and land use. Most transportation planners have overlooked curb parking because nothing is moving. And most land use planners have overlooked curb parking because it's in the roadway. As a result, curb parking has been the Cinderella of both transportation planning and land use. Well, in the high cost of free parking, which was published by the American Planning Association, I argued that parking requirements subsidize cars, increase traffic congestion, pollute the air, encourage sprawl, increase housing costs, degrade urban design, damage architecture, reduce walkability, harm the economy, and penalize poor people. Since then, to my knowledge, no member of the planning profession has argued that parking requirements do not cause these harmful effects. Instead, a flood of research has shown that they do cause these harmful effects. Parking requirements and zoning ordinance are poisoning our cities with too much parking. And they, of course, as I'm sure you know, they severely distort architecture and urban design. Form no longer follows function or fashion or finance. Instead, form follows parking requirements with distressing results. Off-street parking requirements was almost an established religion in city planning, and one shouldn't criticize anyone else's religion. But when it comes to parking requirements, I'm a Protestant, and I believe that planning for parking needs a reformation. Well, the parking requirements are difficult to reform because they don't exist without a reason. If on-street parking is free, removing off-street parking requirements will overcrowd the on-street parking. And people will say, how did you let this happen? How did you let this building be built without enough parking? And now there's a mess of, now I can't find a place to park on the street. Everyone will complain. So to distill 800 pages of the high cost of free parking into 3 bullet points, I recommend 3 parking reforms that I believe can greatly improve cities and the economy and the environment. Well, the first is what you're talking about today, is removing off-street parking requirements. And then developers and businesses can decide how many parking spaces to provide for their customers. They know who their customers are. They know how much parking spaces cost. and they have a reason to provide parking. Getting rid of parking requirements doesn't mean getting rid of parking. That when Buffalo removed all parking requirements in the city and replaced pages of parking report with one sentence saying that no parking is required for any new building. Some people were afraid that all hell would break loose. A few people, but in a study of what happened afterwards, of development since then, the parking supply declined on average, by about 17%. Some buildings provided more parking than had been previously required. Many provided a bit less, and only two, which were affordable housing projects, provided none. And these affordable apartments wouldn't have been built if they had had to provide all the previously required parking. So it's not getting rid of parking, and in any case, there's already a lot of parking. But it just means that you can build a new building with what you think is the right amount of parking for your customers. And then to make this possible, removing off-street parking reforms, I think the city should charge the right prices for on-street parking. And the right prices are the lowest prices that will leave one or two open curb spaces on every block. So there'll be no parking shortages. Prices will balance the demand and supply for on-street parking spaces. And to make that politically possible to charge these market prices for on-street parking, my third policy recommendation is to spend the parking meter revenue to improve public services on the metered streets. So everybody will see their meter money at work. If you have parking meters, and they are not the old-fashioned kind of parking meters, because they can be pay parking stations or paying by cell phone, then if you have parking meters, you'll get the public services. If you don't charge for on-street parking, you don't get the public services. So everybody can see the benefits of charging for parking. These new public services can make the demand-based prices for on-street parking politically popular. So it is, maybe this is a pragmatism that would make Machiavelli blush. But it does appeal to people's self-interest that the residents and the business owners can see that their parking will be well used. Most of the curb spaces will be occupied, but they'll be readily available because there are always one or two spaces available, just as there are in the stores. I understand that when Khrushchev came to the United States in the 1950s, he and everybody with him were just astonished to see that people would go into grocery stores and they could just pick whatever they wanted off of the shelves. Well, I think parking should be more like that. Wherever you go, you'll see one or two parking spaces, and if you're willing to pay for them, you can have them. And I think each of these three policies supports the other two. If cities set curb parking prices to produce one or two open spaces on every block, no one can say there's a shortage of parking, just as you don't see shortages in grocery stores usually. And then spending the revenue to improve neighborhood public services could create political support to charge the right prices for curb parking, to repair the sidewalks, say in some of them, the parking benefit districts, I call them. They clean the sidewalks of the street every night. They steam clean the sidewalks twice a month. Some parking districts give free Wi-Fi to everybody in the area. They plant street trees, they trim street trees. They provide whatever the residents say they want. And I was once speaking in Boston, and it was a day-long conference like yours on parking, and the lunchtime speaker, unlike me, knew nothing about parking, but she gave the smartest advice I'd ever seen. She said that if you want to see parking reforms, don't even mention the word parking. Just ask people what they want in their neighborhood and don't have the money to buy. Just find out what the neighbors want and then tell them, well, here's what some other cities do is that they charge for parking and they spend the revenue to provide these public services. So I think it's good to start out with saying, well, what do you want? And then say, well, some cities are doing this, and it's already happening in Texas. There are parking benefit districts in Austin and Houston and San Marcos and El Paso. And El Paso is the one that I like, that they have very active nightlife. And they run their parking meters till 3 in the morning because they get all the revenue. Now, there's a lot of trash to be collected in areas with a lot of nightlife. So it's a natural way to pay for public services. And it creates political support to charge the right prices. And then if you have the right prices, then you could remove the off-street parking requirements. And that will increase the demand for on-street parking, which will provide even more revenue for public services. Most academics have ignored parking because it's just a low-class thing to study. And research on public policy, national and international affairs seem by far the most important. And then state government is a big step down, and local government looks parochial. And even within the unglamorous realm of local government, parking is the lowest step on the status ladder. Because most people can't imagine anything less interesting than parking. I was a bottom feeder for many years, but there's a lot of food down there. And many other academics have now joined in what's almost a feeding frenzy. And the results show that parking is an important policy issue, not a regulatory detail. Parking affects almost everything, and almost everything affects parking. I think that what cities should do, including Dallas, they should focus less on regulating the quantity of parking and instead focus on the quality of parking, the accessibility, the appearance, the location. But when I looked at the Dallas parking codes, whenever I go to see to a city, I always look at the parking codes. I have to say that the ones in Dallas are the most bizarre I have ever seen. That most of them date from 1967. It seems though nobody's ever looked at them since. For example, Dallas requires for a dance hall 1 parking space for every 25 square feet of the dance floor. But that means the parking lot has to be 14 times bigger than the dance hall. And for a bingo parlor, I mean, how many bingo parlors do you have? But anyway, bingo parlors have to provide 7 times as much parking as there is a bingo parlor. That almost all of the site is a bingo parlor. And the strangest one I've ever seen in any city was for a sewage pumping station. Dallas requires 1 parking spaces for every 1 million gallons of sewage that the station can pump. Well, who came up with that? How do you know that? I would often suggest you ask planners whenever you look at a parking requirement, say, how do you know that? How do you know that a bingo parlor requires 1 parking space for every 50 square feet of the big parlor? I've never been to any city where if you ask a planner, why shouldn't any parking requirement be higher or lower? They don't know, because really they don't know anything about parking requirements. They never learned anything about parking requirements in their planning schools, because the professors teach nothing about them. And the professors teach nothing about them because they don't know anything about them. It seems like such a minor regulatory detail. But just think of all the things that planners don't know when they set parking requirements. They don't know how much parking spaces cost, and neither do you, because it depends enormously on the building and the location. Parking requirements should easily cost Parking spaces can easily cost $50,000 a piece, but that's immaterial to a parking requirement because we just know how many parking spaces are needed somehow. And they don't know how parking requirements affect the cost of housing and everything else. Just because the driver doesn't pay for parking doesn't mean the cost goes away. The cost still has to be paid by somebody. And with minimum parking programs, is everybody but the driver. So everything you do costs more because your parking is free. And I think that everybody who is happy living in a city where everyone else pays for your parking is a fool's paradise. When you look at it very carefully, we're all paying and not even knowing it. We pay higher prices for everything else in order to get lower prices for parking. Well, I've got a lot more to say, but my 20 minutes is up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and hear your comments or any disagreements. I've had plenty of people disagree with me, but I think I've learned how to deal with the disagreements, because parking is it's such a strange topic that it's the most emotional topic in city planning and transportation, that even rational people quickly become emotional, and staunch conservatives become ardent communists, and they argue that we should have plenty of it. And the government should tell you exactly how much to provide. The government knows, and we're telling you how much you want. I think that if the city's trying to run any other aspect of our lives, the way they govern parking, we'd all join the Tea Party. Well, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing what you say and dealing with your comments.
Dr. Shoup, thank you for those opening comments. And I do want to take just a few moments to introduce our other two panelists. We have Andrea Audreya, who is the Interim Assistant Director of the City of Dallas Department of Planning and Urban Design. She brings a combination of Texas planning experience with a European planning knowledge and education that has guided her inquiry into the fundamentals of American zoning and its long-lasting effects. Andrea has led urban planning teams, planned and designed cities and communities, coordinated and reviewed development plans, researched and taught academically urban planning and design. Prior to joining the City of Dallas, she served as planning manager, senior planner in Farmers Branch, and as a director of Urban and Metropolitan Planning Center of Bucharest, Romania. Andrea has a PhD in urban planning for her research on the first comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances of European capital cities. Welcome, Andrea. And also joining us this morning is Patrick Kennedy. He is a founding partner in the Dallas-based urban design firm Space Between Design Studio. He's presently on the board of directors for the Dallas Area Rapid Transit System, DART, and former president on the North Texas chapter of the Congress for the New Urbanism, CNU, North Texas. With more than 15 years of experience tackling complex urban challenges at local, national, and international scales, his focus is on the interrelationship between movement, infrastructure networks, design, and real estate market dynamics in order to deliver successful, lovable, sustainable places. He's also co-founder of A New Dallas, which can be found at www.anewdallas.com, a nonprofit promoting transportation alternatives and neighborhood revitalization, as well as the Coalition for a New Dallas, a political action committee dedicated to electing, educating, and empowering local leaders in support of revitalizing Dallas neighborhoods. He has awards from the North Central Texas Council of Governments, Greater Dallas Planning Council, APA, AIA, AIGA, and ASLA. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists this morning or this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Derwin, and a thank you to the Dallas AIA and the Architecture and Design Exchange of Dallas for hosting this event, as well as the audience. Looks like we have a good number of participants for this topic that I think is one of the most important policy changes the City of Dallas could and should take on, which is minimum off-street parking requirements. And of course, I'm honored to share this virtual room with two personal heroes, Professor Shoup and Andrea. And of course, for the audience, if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A prompt, and we'll try to get to as many of those during the event as possible. And thank you, of course, Professor Shoup, for that opening. The other day, you asked if Dallas had any podium buildings where the floor area of whatever land use sits on top of an above-ground parking structure. You'll be happy to know that we have many. There is one I'm thinking of in particular where there's actually more garage square footage than there is office space. And I think I would estimate that the construction cost of that garage is about a quarter of what the building is on the tax rolls for. Andrea, could you please give us a bit of background on the history of those current parking ordinances in the Dallas Development Code and where the process currently stands in terms of bringing the code into the 21st century, and I would argue ideally aligning with the goals outlined in some of the recently adopted plans and policies such as housing, climate action, and strategic mobility plans?
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good afternoon, Donald Shoup, and thank you for having me. It's a big honor. I'm also surrounded by more than personal heroes here, so thank you. And thank you for a beautiful introduction. It was a long question, so I'm trying to get, I think I retained 3 questions into one, Patrick. So we started working on, I will give a little breakdown on where we are with the process right now. We have discussed and we are working on Dallas Development Code amendment to amend the parking regulations in the city of Dallas since March 2020. And we got it to some sort of a pause in August of this year. We are now taking a break to reflect, to test a little bit, and to write our staff recommendation. I would say that what is interesting and I would like to point out is the fact that between March and August of March of last year, August of this year, we had meetings in a public hearing format with our zoning ordinance advisory committee every 2 weeks. So our entire thought process, and we all learned together about parking in a public format. So everything that we discussed, everything that, every angle, every detail was actually shared in a public eye. And I would like to salute the zoning ordinance committee and our team for doing that sustained for a year. We are now, after again all these discussions, and I would like to also tag on to Professor Donald Shoup's extraordinary introduction, and to some of the extraordinary and very, very important remarks. Yes, we have said all year long that let's please look at how the city is looking right now, what we want our city to look like, and let's please see if we can regulate quality over quantity. So this is something that we also discussed, and it's always, I think, if we ask any member of ZOAC, they will all say the same thing, quality over quantity. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that. Where we are in the spirit of that, where we are right now is we had been instructed, and we all collectively reached out a solution of what if we test a scenario that involves no parking minimum requirements, meaning no more requiring quantity, and regulating quality via design standards, travel demand management, the TDM strategy, and regulating the curb by creating those mechanisms that Dr. Donald Shoup was talking about, like charge the right price and spend the revenue from the meters. So we are also looking into creating a framework for parking benefit districts in Dallas, which is something that we don't have. So this is where we are right now. As for the history of parking and parking regulations and as a whole in Dallas, it is a very, very interesting history. I think we have the first parking ratios from 1947, 45, you know, every zoning ordinance takes a few years, so it's hard to say 47 or 45, I think it's 47. They were very, very flexible and very interesting at that time, but also Dallas was a very small city and cars were different in 47, so obviously the ratios were different. But our zoning code, as again, Donald Shoup opened, basically is based on a zoning philosophy that was done and created with this development code that Dallas is built upon, that was created in 1965 and until like 1969, probably it reached a final form. that's when we started to add these parking ratios. That's when the dance hall, that's 1 per 50 or 1.25 basically goes back to 67. In 1987, we did a transition, but we never did away with the old code, and we didn't change the ratios too much. Actually, in 2012, we did look a little bit and we increased it a little bit. We increased the quantity that's required by the code. So I would say roughly, and I know there's a lot of challenge to my statement here, that we are operating on ratios and from 1965, 67. In the meantime, we became a little bit more, we wanted to be a little bit more friendly, and we introduced some mechanisms to reduce. But I can say that as for quality regulations, or even if we ever dare to say, well, this area should be a no minimum, what if we approach a different philosophy on how to regulate parking or the city? I would say that we've never done that. So we are a little bit delayed in our start to look at a parking reform and at a development code reform in the city of Dallas at all. So thank you for allowing me to speak so much.
Thank you, Andrea. Dr. Shoup, I've got a question for you related to what Andrea is saying the city is looking to potentially propose, which is this sort of carrot and stick approach to the sort of private sector or the development industry, where the carrot is reducing the required minimums or eliminating the required minimums, while adding that sort of qualitative approach that what you do provide has to be or is regulated in terms of it from urban design standards, versus sort of the pros and cons of regulating or adding maximums into the development code.
Well, I think you could do both. I think the simplest and the easiest thing to do is to keep all the numbers the same and declare that they're maximums rather than minimums. I think the numbers are many of them are quite foolish, but they're attempting to say what is the number of parking spaces that are needed, although nobody really knows what that number is. But if Dallas says this is how many parking spaces are needed, the maximum would just say that you can't provide more than we previously said was needed. So I think Mexico City did that, that they had conventional maximums, and then they changed them to minimums. I mean, they had the conventional minimums, and they decreed now that they're maximums. So that's an easy thing to do, and I don't see why you can't, as well, part of the reform, say, put in the design standards. So I can't imagine that many developers would argue with this, because many of the design standards appeal to the customers of their buildings, the tenants of their buildings. If the parking looks better, if it's more accessible, that if there are electric vehicle charging stations and things like that, that I can't imagine that many developers would object to converting a minimum into a maximum, because the minimums force them to spend more than they want to spend on parking. So maybe I misunderstood the question, but I do think that you could do both. You can convert the minimums into maximums, and at the same time add quality regulations, which many cities already do, especially appearance. Say Boulder, Colorado does a lot of things right. They recommend that certainly at least at the ground floor and often all the way above, that the parking structure has to be wrapped with active uses, whether it's offices or apartments. I think everybody's in planning, at least, have heard of this term Texas donuts. So you make parking structure into donuts of active uses. So when you're walking along the street, it looks like an apartment building, but the apartments are just 20 feet deep. Say UCLA has done that on one of its parking structures, that As you drive along the street, it looks like an apartment building, but it's the icing on a parking garage. So I think there are lots of things that will make the building look better and work better.
I'm actually sitting in a office retrofit of a ground floor retail space in one of the very first Texas Donuts, which is in Uptown Dallas, where we actually have garages that have floors that have never actually seen a car, despite the amount that of parking that has been required. One question that often comes up, you brought up Buffalo, that's eliminated minimums. You brought up Mexico City. What are some of the success stories, examples of districts or cities where parking reform may have increased retail sales, revitalization, the availability and turnover of parking, safer streets, mode shift, and I might even throw in rising property tax revenue through densification, which from a Dallas-centric point of view would lessen the overall tax burden on existing residents?
Well, the poster child for reforms is Pasadena, California. And it happened when Rick Cole was the mayor. Rick Cole was now the executive director of the Congress for New Urbanism. And he later became, after being at Pasadena, he became the city manager for Ventura, where he managed the same reforms in Ventura. And of course, now he's at the Congress for New Urbanism. But in Pasadena, it had been just one of the premier shopping centers on the West Coast. It was a very popular resort city for rich Midwesterners in the winter. And its downtown was spectacular in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, the Depression came along and things slid, and then the war came and nothing happened. And then after the war, cars became very popular, and Old Pasadena had very few parking spaces, mainly the curb parking, which is one of the reasons it looks so good. But Pasadena had demolished a large part of the old part of town to do urban renewal. And all the buildings had plenty of parking, but they looked awful. And so they wanted a new way to reform. So they wanted to put in parking meters on the street. And the merchants all said this will chase customers away, the few customers we have away. So they argued for a couple of years, and then finally they said, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the revenue to fix your sidewalks and plant street trees and put historic street furniture and clean the alleys. And the merchants said, well, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Because they knew that their area was underperforming. So they put in the parking meters, and you can borrow money against parking meter revenue. They borrowed enough money to rebuild all of the sidewalks and clean up all of the alleys and put all the wires underground. Right, because they were anticipating the revenue. And then when the city had done what only the city can do, is fix up the public infrastructure, the private property owners came through with historic preservation, which is difficult to do if there are no customers, but now there were customers. And within 5 years, the sales tax revenue in that area tripled. And that's because the business increased so much. And now the Old Pasadena went from being a commercial skid row to one of those popular places to visit in Southern California. 35,000 people on a typical weekend come just to walk around. I mean, they're not looking at the beautifully clean sidewalks or the cast iron tree grates and things like that. You're not staring at your feet, but they know they like it. And so I think that Ventura, California, where Rick Cole was the mayor there, they put in a parking benefit district. and all the money had to be spent in downtown. And I spoke at their city hall and stayed in Ventura for a few days afterwards. I'd never been there before. It's just 60 miles or even less from Los Angeles. But they had a wonderful old main street from the 19th century. And whenever I went to the, we went to eat in restaurants for a couple of days. And every time I went into a restaurant, well, the head waiter or the owner came over and said, "Oh, Professor Shoup, I really liked what you said at the city hall the other night." And I said, "Oh, what do you like? The idea of less traffic congestion and less air pollution?" And they looked at me as though I was the dumbest person on earth. And they said, "No, we want the money." That they knew that if they had more money to spend on public services, their area would be much more popular. And if the parking was managed by meters. But the surprising thing that happened, and that I hadn't predicted, is that the crime rate fell by half in the first year of the parking meters. And it was because the city hired police cadets to manage the parking system, that they were costumed as police officers, but really they were just there to explain how the meters work to people who'd never seen one before, and things like that. So they did a survey of the merchants afterwards, and 95% of them said, "Well, this is a big improvement." So I think that there are many cases where I could point to, but these are two of the easiest to explain as to why the business was improved. Say in old Pasadena, most of the buildings were empty above the ground floor. Now they're all active uses, and it looks much better. I think it's you just have to go to one of these cities that, oh, I don't know, you could go to El Paso and see what happens there. I haven't been to El Paso. I did speak in San Marcos, and I preached what I'm preaching to you. But I hear that San Marcos does a lot of good things in parking.
I think one of your key points and insights is about right pricing on street parking so that there's always one or two spaces available on each block in order to reduce circling. But that also always brings up the question of equity. And I've got a question from Betsy Del Monte here asking, how can market-based parking rates prevent the inequity of only wealthy people being able to park in dense areas?
Well, that's an important question. I've heard it often, and I've got several answers. One, drivers have to pay market prices for their cars, or the fuel and the maintenance and the repairs and the insurance and the registration fees. But nobody argues that all of these should be free because charging them would hurt the poor. Why is it that you say that only rich people will be able to park when there are all these other costs that the drivers have to pay? What's different about free curb parking and off-street parking requirements, and they go together, is that off-street parking requirements mean that people who are too poor to own a car still have to pay. They have to pay more for all their groceries. That if somebody a poor person who takes the bus to the grocery store has to pay higher prices in the grocery store, so richer people can park free when they drive to it. So I think it's and cities, if they're, I think often, I'm not saying that your questioner did it, is that they always ask this question about parking and nothing else, is because they're using poor people as human shields, saying that don't charge for parking because it'll hurt poor people. But really the idea is that they don't want to pay parking for themselves. The real problem with free off-street, free curb parking and high minimum parking requirements is that most of the subsidy goes to people who are not poor, and most poor people get very little subsidy. So it's not effective philanthropy. I think one way to show this was in San Francisco, where they have permit parking, and all the residents could get permits. Danielle Steele, who was the famous romance novelist, it was learned in a report of the paper that she had 26 residential parking permits around her mansion in Pacific Heights. So I think when you look at it carefully, that free curb parking is not the right way to help poor people. I think that, and another thing that I won't say is that cities give, you know, say electricity and water and gas are far more essential than curb parking for low-income people, and we give lifeline discounts to them. If you want to help poor people, when you're adding charges for curb parking, you could give a lifeline discount to low-income people, to drivers. But if you give cheap parking to low-income drivers, you should also give the same subsidy to low-income people who don't own a car. There are many low-income people who don't own a car, and the subsidy for parking doesn't help them at all. So I think we've tried to subsidize so many people through parking policies that most of the subsidy goes to rich people, or people who have more than enough money. Let's put it that way. Not to rich people, but they have plenty of money. And anyway, in San Francisco, they did when San Francisco started these right prices for parking, two professors at Berkeley hired a lot of students to look at all the cars that were parked in the curb in the priced areas and the non-priced areas. And then they took the license plate, they found the make and model and everything else, and they got the resale price. And it turned out the resale, the sale price, the blue book price as it's called, was no different in areas that charged for parking and the areas that did not. So there's no evidence that, and anyway, in San Francisco, 30% of the population doesn't own a car. And most of that 30% is the lowest income people. So I think it's well intentioned, but I think gravely mistaken to say that we should not reform parking policies because it will hurt the poor. It'll help the poor.
Interesting. And Andrea, something that's come up that we haven't really discussed too much is parking benefit districts. And Professor Shoup had mentioned that one of the side benefits was reduction of crime in the uptown area. We've been discussing the concept of a parking benefit district in order to help pay for increased security. Is our parking benefit district something the city is exploring, and what would that look like?
Currently, obviously, as Dr. Shoup was saying, the right-of-way is not under the land use code. But because we're talking about a parking reform, we felt that we need to address this as a big concern as well. We do not have parking benefit districts in the city, but we do have other means of supervising or regulating on-street parking. We do have resident parking only permits. We do have no parking on one side or whatever signs. So we do have those, but obviously a complaint was how are they enforced, who's parking there, and the fact obviously that they're kind of like discounted when there is a need. So we are proposing just a general framework for a parking benefit district. This is how it's going to work because we don't have that. And probably we're going to propose that to be as a separate ordinance, not a land use. But it is a necessary tool to the city as it is right now, even with minimums. Because again, we have issues with overspill and disregard of other things when we're trying to regulate the right of way. So we're proposing to create a framework and then to allow neighborhoods and to allow the city to come in and establish these districts.
Well, I can add something to that. If you do,
yes, please.
If you do manage parking with stations with time limits, a very common way to look at it is that all the revenue comes from parking tickets, which are very much of a burden on low-income people. Say in Los Angeles, you get the fine for overstaying at the meter or parking on a street during a street cleaning day is $70. And that is a lot of money for a low-income person, more than a day's wages. So I think if you moved away from a regulation, it's expensive to manage. You have to have people giving tickets that causes great, distress and arguments, even murders over parking tickets, that are disputes over parking. If you did it by price, it's the way we price gasoline, for example. Nobody objects to the idea that we charge for gasoline depending on the market, although it's very expensive now, but it's much cheaper than most countries, but because of our low taxes. But if you went to demand-based prices for curb parking, you'd have far fewer tickets. There was a study in New York that looked at how many parking tickets were given on the streets. It turned out that if you reduced the occupancy just by 5% from 100% occupancy to 95% occupancy, the number of parking violations fell by 50%. The reason people get tickets is often because there's no legal parking. You park at a bus stop or a fire plug or something like that because there's just no place else to park. But if you have demand-based prices, there are 1 or 2 open spaces on every block, many fewer people will violate the law. So I think you get less from fines, which are very unpopular and very bad revenue source, and you'll just get it from people who pay for parking.
There's one question that I think is really important here locally as part of the discussion that, as we're running out of time, I want to make sure we get to, and that's from Planning Commissioner Melissa Kingston, where she says parking is the primary tool that neighborhoods use to regulate uses and the proliferation of uses like bars and restaurants in areas like Lower Greenville. How do you suggest Dallas regulate uses like bars and restaurants without parking minimums when the city cannot regulate alcohol sales?
Well, I think that this happens everywhere. That if people don't like fast food restaurants like McDonald's or something like that they have very high parking requirements. It's often for fast food restaurant in Los Angeles, the parking lot is 3 times larger than the fast food restaurant. And the excuse for that is given as, well, we don't like McDonald's in our neighborhood. But then the McDonald's you get is even more offensive. There's more asphalt and more cars and everything else. So when you use this very substandard way to regulate is to say, well, we'll have higher parking requirements. You get more asphalt, more cars, uglier restaurants. Now all the money goes to pay for the parking lot rather than the restaurant itself. So parking is a terrible way to regulate, to try to discourage dance halls or bingo parlors or whatever it is you want to get rid of. The city should regulate those those items directly. You could do it the same, but you have to have you can have higher alcohol taxes for one thing if that's what you want to do. You could, or you just have planning regulations that I don't know if it's a Texas law saying you can't say that a bar can't be within 1,000 yards of a elementary school or something like that. That's the way we often regulate these things. Is they can't be near something. So I think that there are many ways that cities can regulate bars, and I don't see. You say bars and restaurants. Do you not want restaurants? That I think that if you had restaurants with fewer parking spaces, more people would walk to restaurants. There would be more restaurants because it'd be easier to convert an old building into a restaurant. Now you can't reuse most old buildings for a new restaurant because it doesn't have the required parking. It isn't just for new buildings, it's for reusing old buildings. It would make old buildings much more usable, I suppose, is if you could convert it to anything you wanted to without going to the planning desk and having them say, where is your required parking? Now, there would be many more restored buildings converted into restaurants without any parking, except the on-street parking. But I think that if nobody will open a restaurant if they think that people are not going to come, and they would selectively find a place. Maybe there's a public parking structure nearby. Oh, and as you say, you came when you said that the most parking garages, the top levels are never used. I always go to the top of a parking garage in cities when I visit them for two reasons. One, you get a great view of the city because they're so tall. Second, there are never any oil spots on the top of parking garages, implying that cars have never parked there. You could often go up, but who would take the elevator to the 10th floor to look out from a parking structure? But often then I walk down, and you see that many other floors are empty on the way down as well.
When I lived in a high rise, what was one thing that always was curious to me or new to me was that there was actually a rush hour to use the elevators to get into the garages and go up to the high rise. Andrea, for those that are interested in being involved and helping to shape the policy as this moves forward, how can interested parties get involved?
Well, thank you for this question. Yes, please do get involved. You can always email to us. You can always reach out to your council member, to your city plan commissioner. But I would recommend everybody, what we recommended from day one, a year and a half or 2 years ago, is please do send things in writing. Even if you change your mind, it is important. We always attach them to any memo. We distribute them to all the commissions. We will continue to have them available to elected and appointed officials. So it is very important to obviously to come to sign up to speak at ZOAC, at CPC, City Plan Commission, and to get involved or reach out to staff. We're always open if you want to send us an email for a meeting or anything, but I cannot stipulate or say this strongly enough. Please do send things in writing.
I think that's really important. Not just in parking, but in everything. I think there's a rule at UCLA. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. Saying something is all of no use. It has to be written down before anybody will acknowledge that it happened.
I think one thing that the city of Dallas does pretty well is that once you do get involved, once you do sign up to speak, you get included in email blasts of when meetings are coming, but you have to get involved that very first time. And Enrique McGregor had added in the chat that individuals can always ask to be included in the list of interested parties, so they know when ZOAC is meeting. Related to that, Andrea, do you have a sense of when formal policy proposals might be coming to ZOAC, the Plan Commission, and City Council?
I am hoping first quarter of next year, probably end of January, I would say. We're working right now behind the scenes, as I was laying out in the beginning.
Excellent, excellent. And it looks like we have a hard stop at 1:05, so maybe we can get to another question. We have a number in the chat that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Maybe Andrea and I can spend some time responding and writing to some more of these. Professor Shoup, one other equity concern that often comes up is those of the service industry workers who may not be able to afford a metered space for an 8-hour shift. How should we address that issue if we do go to dynamic pricing in high demand areas?
Well, that's an important question. Whenever I go to a restaurant, I always ask the waiters, where did you park? And often, if it's an area where there are meters and they stop operating at 6 o'clock, they say, oh, I try to get here at around 5 or 5:30 when the meters are still running, and I'll pay for half an hour, and then I get to use the space all evening long. So, well, that's what happens in El Paso when they run the meters till 3 in the morning. Well, one of the problems with waiters using the curb parking is that it's not available to their customers who give them tips. They're not, the restaurants don't do as well. It's not a good idea if your waiters are using all the curb spaces in front of the restaurant. So I think charging for parking will make spaces available for the customers. And what some cities do, and I would recommend it, is that they have a program for low-income, not just waiters, of course, but anybody who works in the area, any nighttime worker, the cleaning staff or whatever, that they give them either free parking in the off-street garages, or they give them a very big discount. Often there are municipal parking garages that are underused in the evening, so it really doesn't cost the city anything. But I think it's much more productive for low-income workers to offer the free parking, off-street parking, rather than to say we have to leave the curb parking free because it'll be a hardship for them. And I think that, on top of that, I would do another good thing that Boulder, Colorado does, is that they have put in parking meters downtown, and they use the revenue to provide a free bus pass for everybody who works downtown, not just low-income people, but for everybody. So people who park at the curb pay for transit passes for people who take the bus. I think if you're thinking of equity, it's much better than to have free curb parking in a pathetic attempt to try to help low-income people.
That's a great point. And as a transit board member, I always point out that it costs more for a monthly transit pass than the average monthly parking pass in downtown Dallas, which is unfortunate. And as you point out, why have free parking and charge $3 for a transit ride? Well, I would like to thank you so much, Professor Shoup and Andrea, for taking the time. Thank you for the audience and all the questions submitted. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. I've got several more pages. I wish I had several more hours with Dr. Shoup to get to some of those questions, but always enjoy his insight. And thank you again to Dallas AIA for hosting this event.